Hello movie fans, my name is Leilani. I'm going to be reviewing The Boy, released in 2016, directed by William Brent Bell. This movie is a lot, so let's get started. So the movie quickly introduces us to our main characters, the protagonist being Greta, a woman from Montana who is hired by the Hilshire family to watch their son over the summer. We also learn later in the movie that Greta is running away from her abusive ex-boyfriend, but that doesn't really come into the movie until like the third act, so we'll get to that later. The Hilshires are the family who hired Greta to watch their son. They're kind of creepy, and they live in this really big estate in the middle of nowhere. And finally, we're introduced to Malcolm. Dreamboat alert, he's the grocery delivery boy that works for the Hilshires and delivers their groceries once a week, and also immediately starts hitting on Greta as soon as they meet. And last but certainly not least, we're introduced to Brahms, who is an actual doll. The Hilshires treat this doll like he's their 10-year-old son, and Greta has been hired to take care of this doll over the summer. Malcolm also explains later that the Hilshires had a real son named Brahms who died in a tragic accident, and the doll was their way of compensating for the loss of their child. So as you might expect from a horror movie, the seemingly innocent doll that Greta has been hired to take care of may have more to him than meets the eye, and that's when our movie starts to get creepy. Now I'll get into my actual review of the movie. Overall, I wasn't a huge fan for several reasons. First, I'm going to talk about some surface issues that I have with the movie. The movie is filled with tons of cliches, including, but not limited to, the fact that the movie takes place in a house in the middle of the woods with no self-service or internet. Then, things initially start to get creepy on a dark and stormy night. The movie is full of creepy phone calls that, spoiler alert, are coming from inside the house. And there are count 'em, two instances where the main character wakes up from a nightmare in a cold sweat. Another issue that I had with the movie was its overuse of jump scares. I don't mind a jump scare here or there in a horror movie, but the way they were using these didn't really make sense to me. Some of the jump scares were just plain stupid.
Hi there.
Some of the jump scares were really just trying too hard. And there was one jump scare where I honestly had no idea what I was supposed to be scared of.
Okay, this scene here. I had a major problem with this jump scare because of the fact that this scene is already so dark that you can barely tell what's going on. After seeing this initial jump scare, I really had no idea what I was supposed to be scared of. All I heard was a loud blast of noise in my ears and the fact that Greta screamed and fell over. Let's go back and watch this again. This. Okay. All I can see is this little closet and this fabric-looking thing and this little sliver of light here. It took me 4 or 5 rewatches to figure out that this is the sliver of somebody's arm, and this is supposed to be the figure of a person that I'm looking at. Just put some lights on your subject, please. If the only contrast I'm getting is this little sliver of light and this background here, you could rework your lighting choices in this scene.
Other than that, there were some deeper issues with the movie that I had as well. The first one that stuck out to me the most when I was watching was the sheer amount of gaslighting that the audience experienced. It seemed like the movie couldn't pick whether they wanted the audience to think that Brahms was haunted or not. In the first act, the movie insisted that Brahms wasn't actually haunted and it was all in Greta's head. There are several examples of this gaslighting in the first act. All of the times in the first act where Brahms was explicitly doing something creepy or supernatural ended up being nightmares. There was an instance where Greta heard the sound of a child crying throughout the house. She went to go look at the Brahms doll, and it looked like he had tears in his eyes, but it turns out it was just a leak in the roof. You know that jump scare that I was so mad about before, with the little arm sliver? Well, turns out that was just a mannequin in the attic, and Greta had nothing to actually be afraid of. And finally, to put a nice little bow on all the creepy things that were happening in Act 1, Malcolm suggests that Greta was sleepwalking, and she had been behind all the weird things that were happening in the house. To be fair, all the gaslighting throughout the movie could have been a nod to the abusive relationship Greta had with her ex. Gaslighting is a major red flag of abusive relationships, but honestly, I think that's giving the director too much credit. Then, for Act 2, the movie completely shifts gears and insists that Brahms actually is haunted. An example of this is when Greta is home alone and she gets a creepy phone call from what sounds like Brahms, asking her to come out and play, saying that he made her her favorite, and Greta opens the door to find a peanut butter and jelly outside. This transitions us into a bit of a honeymoon stage, where Greta is fully on board with the idea that the Brahms doll is actually alive. She proves this to Malcolm by drawing a line of chalk around the Brahms doll, going away, and returning to find that the doll has moved. Now, Malcolm is on board with the idea that the Brahms doll is haunted, and the audience should be too. But the movie still can't decide what they want the audience to think, so for Act 3 we transition into the real reason behind all of these supernatural things. Act 3 is thrown into gear by the return of Greta's abusive ex. So, naturally, Greta asks the Brahms doll for help getting rid of her ex. Apparently, Cole is so fed up with this whole charade that he breaks the Brahms doll, and then we see what's actually been going on this entire time. Brahms is, surprise, not actually dead. Turns out this adult has been living in the walls watching Greta for the entire time that she's been there. I'll be honest, I didn't see the twist coming, and I actually did enjoy the climax of this movie. But the problem was, the movie spent so much time going back and forth between whether we should think the Brahms doll was haunted that it took away from the impacts that the twist would have had. Other than the plot itself, I think the fact that the movie was rated PG-13 was the biggest contributor to its failure. There are plenty of examples of ways that the movie could have improved if it allowed itself to have an R rating. No, don't get me wrong, I don't like gore at the best of times. I think in instances like slasher movies, it's used as a cop-out for actual scary content. But if you're having a known murderer actively killing people in the climax of the movie, you're gonna want to see a little blood. Take this scene for example. Another big issue with the PG-13-ness of this movie was the fact that the protagonist survived at the end. Honestly, they had all their odds stacked against them. Greta was alone in the house for the entire movie and could have been killed at any point, yet somehow she and Malcolm survive at the end and are able to drive away? How does that work? Were they ever in any danger, or were they just clever and strong enough to outwit this person who had been methodically watching them for several weeks? Before I get to my overall rating of the movie, I have some miscellaneous things that I want to highlight. Overall, the acting was mostly fine. Lauren Cohan, who played Greta, did spend the majority of the movie acting next to a literal doll, so considering she was able to keep her composure in situations like this, that's a nod to her. The cinematography was actually quite good. There's a lot of imagery of goats, including this really gorgeous shot. Check that out! They have the reflection of Greta in the goat's eye. Fun fact, goats' pupils are actually rectangular, as you can see in this taxidermy here. All of this goat imagery could be a nod to how Satan is portrayed as a goat or a goat-like being in a lot of Christian art. I'll give the director the benefit of the doubt on that one. So here's my overall opinion of the movie. I think the fact that this movie is PG-13 was very limiting. It meant that the majority of the runtime wasn't filled with scary content. Even in the climax, the lack of lighting in all the scenes, the overuse of shaky cam, and the lack of actual gore made the whole situation not that scary. You'd think that since this was director William Brent Bell's fourth time directing a horror movie, he would get away from the cheap scare tactics and overused cliches, but nope, those were still present in this movie. Like I said before, the twist that Brahms was actually alive the entire time didn't really work for me because of the lack of build-up, and the movie didn't want to stick to its guns in terms of whether the audience should think the doll is haunted or not. I think if they had picked one, it would have made the twist a lot more effective in the end. I've said it once and I'll say it again. The use of cliches and cheap scare tactics in this movie really took away from it. Especially for me, who's somebody who doesn't scare easily, you really have to work hard to make the movie frightening, and this movie didn't do it for me. And my final rating is 2 out of 5 stars. Keeping with the theme of overused cliches, the adult Brahms somehow survived after getting stabbed twice, and is seen at the end of the movie piecing together the shattered pieces of the Brahms doll. This opens the door for a sequel to The Boy, currently known as The Boy 2. But honestly, after watching it myself, and the fact that this movie has a critic score of 30% on Rotten Tomatoes, I think director William Brent Bell should follow Greta's lead and put Brahms to bed.